can start from, I mean, whatever lecture you prefer to start from. So if you have any question, please ask.
I was wondering, how do we justify the assumption made on the Wright-Fisher model or the Moran model?
Which assumption?
Sorry?
Which assumption?
For example, that the sampling is random with replacement at each time. That this assumption is empirically verified or not?
No, I mean, these are not, okay, so these kind of models like the Moran model or the Wright-Fisher model, you should not interpret them as something that aims to be an accurate description of all the process that happens in microevolution, right? What they are is that they are a baseline, and you can add the details that go beyond this baseline. So you can think that as a null expectation, right? So under what assumption do you expect this null expectation to sort of not be so null and describe well the system? Or when you expect to have small deviation, well, first of all, you expect that there are no selection advantages, so that whatever initial group of alleles or variants you have, they are going to have the same fitness, and they don't differ in their reproduction ability. So this is the first assumption. So there are, for instance, what I call the loci, so position on the DNA, and if you track the evolution of this position on the variants of the alleles of this position of DNA, they don't have any effect. So they are neutral variation. They don't contribute to fitness, and you can expect that they follow dynamics, which is somehow similar to what described by the Moran model or Wright-Fisher model. There are other assumptions, though. One other assumption is that the total population size is fixed, so which means that you have a system where there is no variation of that quantity, and that is conserved, and which is not necessarily true in general. And the other assumption, well, the Moran model and Wright-Fisher model have different assumptions on how reproduction happens, right? So the Wright-Fisher model, you have non-overlapping generations, which means that you have discrete time steps, and all the individuals reproduce at each time step. So at every time step, you have a new population. For instance, if you have annual plants, you can imagine that these time points are years, and you have a new population every year, right? And this population is born from the seed of the previous generation. In the Moran model, instead, you have overlapping generations, which is what we are more used to, which means that an individual reproduces, and the children of an individual meets individuals that were alive when the parent was present, right? Or that you spend time with your children, if you want. This means that you have overlapping generations. Now, this depends on the context. So the other point is that they are not probably well descriptors of what happens in, I mean, let's say, in the natural environment, there are many complications one can have, and that could influence the evolution. On the other, so you could have factors that vary the population size, etc., etc., etc. On the other hand, if you have, for instance, a laboratory setting, if you do microevolution experiments, then you can put yourself in a condition when these actually expectations are verified. Okay. So if you do an experiment with bacteria where you keep the population size sort of fixed, you do, for instance, evolution in a chemostat, then the assumption of having constant population size is not that wrong, and you have a dead term that in that case is constant for it's completely random. And regarding the birth term, of course, if you are tracking mutations that have an advantage, then you expect something else. But if you track mutations that are neutral, probably a Moran model will do a good job. Okay. Does that answer your question, or you wanted to?
No, thanks. Thanks.
Okay. Too long to answer the question, probably. I mean, the other point is that, of course, I mean, it's not the end of the story, right? So, I mean, it's also the first model we introduced. So this can be expanded in many different ways, and we explore some of those. But there is, for instance, a lot of work on what happens when you don't have a constant population, even on average, but you have an expanding population. Right? So imagine that something similar to the video I showed on the bacteria and antibiotics, right? You have a population which expand spatially, and then you can try to understand how mutations arise and how they confer an advantage or disadvantage and how they expand in the population. So think of this as the step one, or step one.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any other question about this or previous lecture?
I have a question about the last lecture in Ecology.
Yes.
So when we wanted to calculate the probability of extinction at a given time, so we find like no trivial result. So for me, so we find the result when if the birth rate is higher than the death rate, then we have an exponential average, and if the death rate is bigger than the birth rate, then we will go to extinction on the long run.
Yes.
So actually, I don't see the stochasticity in this part. I mean.
Well, I mean, if the death rate is larger than the birth rate, there is no effect of stochasticity on the fixation probability, in the sense that what you get is exactly what you, on the extinction probability. So
please, can you repeat, because I lost you.
Okay, sorry. What I was saying is that if the death rate is larger than the birth rate, what you know is that the probability that you go to extinction is 1, right?
Yes.
Which is what you would expect naively.
No, but I guess since it is a stochastic process, we may just find it like, I mean, it's not 1. It goes like when B is higher than D. So if the birth rate is much bigger, then the probability to go to extinction is almost 0. But not like just 1.
Yeah, exactly. So no, I was talking about the case where when the death rate is larger than the birth rate. Yeah. So if the birth rate is larger than the death rate, the average behavior is that you grow exponentially, but you have a fraction of the trajectories that actually hit 0. Right?
Okay.
But I'm not sure about the question. So
I mean, why we don't have the same thing when the death rate is bigger? So the fraction of the trajectory can.
Okay. Well, because the point is that So the point is, yes, I'll drop this. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so the point is the following. So let's say that the birth rate is larger than the death rate. Then if you start a trajectory, what happens is that on average, you will grow exponentially, right? And you're going to have trajectories that do like this, trajectory that behaves sort of like the average, trajectory that goes faster than the average, trajectory that goes to extinct soon, etc., right? So this is what happens. And the point is that in the long time limit, you have either trajectories that go to 0, that have gone to 0, or trajectories that have gone to very large numbers and will never go to 0. Okay. Now, the fact that you have these two possibilities is because when B is larger than D, you have a force that pushes you to large values. Right? On the other end, where D is larger than B, you have a force that pushes you towards zero. Okay. So what happens in this case is somewhat more interesting, is that you can have, I mean, let's say that you start here, the expectation is that you go to zero exponentially, right? Now, this is true on average. You have many trajectories that goes to zero like this, but you have also trajectories that grows a lot before going to zero. Okay. Now, if you wait long enough, all the trajectories are going to hit zero. Okay.
Yes.
But since you have a force that pushes you towards zero, then eventually you will always end up there. Right? So the question is then, I mean, this is something that from the perspective of the extinction probability, you don't see anything different from what you would expect from the deterministic system. What is different is the time it takes to go to extinction, right? It can take a short time or it can take a long time, okay?
Yes.
And if you do the calculation, if I remember it correctly, you should get that the probability of going to extinct after a time t, at time t, is something that is proportional to 1 over t to the 3/2. And here you have the exponential of t over some scale t star, where this t star, I believe, is something like probably d over, not the opposite, probably b over d minus b, something like this, okay? So it is something that you see that for b, d larger than b, this is positive, right? So and it becomes larger and larger as d becomes closer to b, right? And when d is close to b, this time scale diverges. And the reason it diverges is that there are some trajectories that are going to zero with infinite time. And those trajectories that goes to zero with infinite time are the ones that actually don't go to zero. So there is an effect, I mean, there is an effect of, we are going to see that in one of the next lectures, actually in one on epidemiology, but there is an effect of stochasticity.
It is like a biased random walk.
It is, yes. It's exactly like, I mean, from the perspective of the extinction probability is exactly like a biased random walk, in the sense that you have a bias toward the right, and you want to know whether you, what is the probability of hitting zero, right? You start here, and you want to know what is the probability of hitting zero. And the probability is exactly the same as the one of a random walk, where you move to the right or to the left with different probabilities. This is true for the probability of extinction. This is not true for the time it takes to go to extinction necessarily, because the probability of moving to the left or the right depends on the state where you are. So here you move more, I mean, you have more stochasticity, here you have less stochasticity. Is that clear?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Good. Any other question?
I have a question, but it's regarding like the Fisher Price videos. So I don't know if we are there yet or.
Oh yeah, there was a question about. I mean, I think we can move randomly. It's fine.
Okay.
There was a question about the Moran model, so we can.
Okay. So first of all, it's just in the first, the replicator equation is independent of the of growth the population is having, right? So I can generalize this replicator equation for any kind of growth, or it's just for the three types we saw. Yeah.
Or you can generalize it for anything. The point is, I mean, you can, in general, when you, let me share this. Can you hear me? Gravin, you are, yeah, Gravin is frozen.
Yeah, we can hear you. But
yeah, sorry, I have a little bad internet connection, but
okay.
Now I can hear you.
Okay, I'll try to reply. So it's true in general that if you have an equation like n dot equal to n some, sorry, no, let's not use it. Some function, let's call it g of n. Sorry, here you have ni, ni, ni. It's always true that when you go to, sorry, when if you define xi equal to ni over capital N, and you introduce the notation like sum over I xi, whatever function q you have is equal to the average of q, right? But this can be a q of the xi and then it's true that if you write the equation for xi dot, what you get is xi g of xi times n minus the average g x. This is true in general, independently of this form. Right. In the cases we have seen, these eventually these reduce to having this term here, actually not exactly this term here, but there is a constant, there is a term that simplifies between these two, and this becomes something which is fi, where this is actually a number, it's not, there is a gi, and here it's n. You get fi, which is actually a number, minus the average of fi. Okay. So that's true, for instance, in all the cases where this is ni, and this is a function like fi minus whatever q of n. Okay. If you have something like this, then you end up to this. Does that answer?
Yeah, definitely. And I have another question where it's sort of like because one of the books you recommended, the one of Richard Dawkins, the Selfish Gene, I wrote it, I read it a long time ago, and I remember he talking about a replicator. So this is the same. Just if I read it again.
Yes, the
replicator
equation. This is a very interesting. I mean, we have introduced this in this context, but it has it's sort of a central object in also in evolutionary game theory. So in the branch that studies how population that is actually changing its frequency because it perform. I mean, that is, let's say, that has the reproductive fitness related to some strategy, right? And this strategy is how it basically determines how it interacts with other individuals. Then the change of this population is determined by replicator equation. So it's something that is a sort of central object in evolutionary game theory and in evolutionary dynamics. But it emerges naturally when you want to describe fractions instead of abundances, right? And it's the only thing you need in the moment when you assume that the total population size is a constant, either because you set it or you do a separation of time scales.
And just to finish the chapter, I have like a little problems in interpreting the last the last plots you make when you compare the tightly correlated population with the phase space of the QMP. So I don't know if you can like explain the second one, because that's the one that caused me trouble.
Okay, sure. So yes, that was related to this equation. And what one finds in the price equation, well, in the price equation, you say we have a trait QI, you know, the color of your eyes. And this trait QI is somehow, something is a property of individuals, which is heritable, and some relation with the fitness, right, in principle. And what we ask is, how do we expect the QI to change over time, assuming that the population is changed accordingly to replicator equation, which we derived previously. And what one gets is that this is equal to the covariance of FQ, okay? Where the covariance of FQ is F, the average of FQ minus Q, okay? So the covariance is something which is like a correlation. So are you familiar with what is a correlation?
Yeah.
So a correlation, let's say, let's call it rho, is a number between -1 and 1, and is -1 if the variables are perfectly anticorrelated, independently of the slope, right? And it's 1 if they are perfectly correlated, okay? And it's 0 if the points are on a ball, and these are sort of in between if you have different correlation. Okay? So the covariance is equal to the correlation times the variance, well, let's not call it the variance of the standard deviation, sorry, let's call it the standard deviation of F, standard deviation of Q. Okay, this is what the covariance is. This is actually how you calculate the correlation, right? You calculate the correlation as FQ minus FQ divided by the standard deviation of F, standard deviation of Q. Okay.
Okay.
So what I'm saying is, how does this depend on the variation of F and Q? So if you, let's say, if you fix a correlation, let's say rho equals 0.5, right? And you have two cases with the rho equals 0.5, you can have something like this or something like this, right? So let's say that these two have the same coefficient of variation, but in this case you have a smaller standard deviation of F and Q, and in this case you have a smaller standard deviation of F and Q, a larger standard deviation, okay? So what this tells you is that in this case, you go faster, right?
Okay.
Now, the other scenario is the case where you, let's say that you fix the standard deviation of F and Q to some value. You can have a case where rho is small, or a case where rho is large, right? So you fix the typical variability, and you can have something like this, or you can have something like this, right? But there is very little variability, right? So if the correlation is higher, given some variability, you expect that the speed is faster. If the variation is smaller, you expect that the variation is smaller. Right? This is sort of intuitive, right? If, let's say, if Q, whatever Q is measuring, is something that is not correlated with the fitness, you don't expect it to change on average, right? Let's say that having a given color of the eye is not related to fitness, then you don't expect that the well, let's say that height is not related to reproductive fitness. So individuals that are taller reproduce more, and individuals that are shorter reproduce less, or vice versa. Then you don't expect height to change over time, according to this equation. If they are correlated, then you expect it to change.
Okay.
If they are positive correlated, you expect that the average height of the population goes up. If they are negatively correlated, it goes down.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Any other question? Also about the long chapter on the introduction to evolution. If you have
I have a question, but is regarding the lesson 11.
sorry?
11?
Yes.
Yeah, when we're studying the model of bird-death migration, in a point, yeah, in a point you study the derivative of time of the probability p. In a point you say like this derivative has to be equal to 0. You mentioned very quickly something about that this expression allowed to separate non-equilibrium from equilibrium statistical mechanics.
Yes.
Yeah. Why?
Yeah. Are those things that one should not say because they don't give any information. And I mean, no, actually, I think it's good to say because it sort of opens things up. So the point is actually the difference between equilibrium and non-equilibrium dynamics is the fact that in general, you can imagine that you have, well, you're going to see that I'm going to mention it more explicitly in the next lecture, but I can start.
Okay.
So imagine that you have some configurations, right? These configurations which belong to some space, right? In our case, these configurations are integers, for instance. You can have a population which is 0, 1, etc. Now you can write a master equation where you describe how this probability of having a given configuration change over time, and this involves some sum over all the configurations of the rate at which you go from the C prime to C times the probability of being in C prime minus the probability of going to C prime, probability of being in C. Okay. This as, I mean, think of this as our case. In our case, C are the integers, and so these, for instance, this rate here is the death rate n prime delta n prime n plus 1 plus p n prime delta n prime n minus 1, for instance, right? So it's something that if n prime is equal to n plus 1, the rate is d n plus 1. And if n is equal to n minus 1, the rate is b n minus 1. So what we did in this case is that we said, well, you have these currents, right? You can define some currents J of n, and what you get is something like a sum, but actually what you get is that the probability is something like J of n minus J of n minus 1, okay? And then I showed you how this implies that J of n is constant, and from the boundary conditions, we got J of n is equal to 0. Okay?
Yes.
Now, in general, this happens because we are moving effectively on a one-dimensional space. Right? We go from n plus 1, n plus 2, n plus 3. But you could have scenarios where that is not the case. And if that is not the case, here you don't have just this, right? You have a sum over all the possible steps, and you end up with something which is something like the sum over C of some, let's call it delta J of C. Okay, you get an equation like this. Okay, where this delta J is exactly this term. Actually. Okay. Now, the point is that, again, I'm not pretending that I'm describing it efficiently and well, but I think it's important that you get the connection. So in this one-dimensional case, what we are effectively doing is that we are saying, well, when we set this to 0, right, we have a sum over the C prime of this quantity equal to 0. And in this case, we can say delta J of C prime is equal to 0. Okay? Now, in general, when you see an equation like this, you are tempted to remove this sum and say, well, let's have all the terms equal to 0. There are scenarios when you can do it, and that is equilibrium statistical physics, if you want. And there are cases where you cannot do it, and that defines our non-equilibrium steady state, which is exactly characterized by the presence of non-zero currents. I know this is not a good answer because it sort of mentions many things that we have not defined.
Yeah, because I don't understand, for example, the concept of current.
Yeah, that's the problem. I have not defined, right? And it's not something that I could have defined well in this context. I'll try to give an idea more carefully in the following lectures.
Yeah, because for example, if that condition of each J is equal to 0, we are in the regime of not equilibrium system.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of a current in this context is that suppose that you are in a given configuration, or actually suppose that you take, well, it's actually like this. Suppose that you take a given set of configurations. So you take, I don't know, 3 different values of the populations.
Okay.
And you imagine that you are, and these values are like a sort of cycle, right? So you go from n to n plus 1, to n plus 1 to n plus 2, and then you go back.
Okay.
Okay. You can ask, what is the probability of doing it in one direction and then back, or doing in the opposite direction? Okay. Now, when you have one dimension, this doesn't have any effect, but suppose that you have populations. Suppose that you have 2 different populations.
Okay.
You say, I can first increase, suppose that you have 2 populations. You have N and M, right? And you say, well, I can go from N to M to N plus 1 M, then to N plus 1 N plus 1, then to N plus, then I can go to N plus 1, and then I go to M, right? So actually, I go back here, right? Now, what you can ask is, when I'm at steady state, okay, so suppose that I have a given probability of being here, of being here, of being here, of being here, which is the one at steady state, the one you see for long times. What is the probability of observing this cycle? So you go from here to there, to there, to there, and back, versus the reverse cycle.
Yeah. This has to be with the tail balance and balance, right?
Yes. This is, yes, I didn't want to say the word, but this is exactly the plan.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, the point is that, I mean, in some sense, since we are in one dimension, the only way you can do a cycle is that you go back to the same path, right? You can go to n plus 1, but then you go to n minus 1. So the probability of doing this and then that, or the probability of doing, there is only one way to do the cycle, right? So you cannot do it in different directions.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
So it's, I mean, yeah, in one dimension you don't have this possibility to see this non-equilibrium effect. Again, probably I said something I should not have said because it was involving concept that I didn't explain. Not explain there.
So,
but it's all goes into the unknown. So
I mean, just to conclude something out this, if I mean, because the condition that J goes to 0 is just when the population goes to extinction, right? So if the population doesn't go to extinction, we are out of equilibrium.
No. In that case, you don't have extinction. I mean, you can have in the bird death migration, you can have extinctions in the sense that the population goes to 0, but since you have migration, then can.
Okay. Could be okay. No extinction. Just, okay. Yeah.
The point is that we briefly discussed last time as well. So the point is, those conditions guarantee you that for large times, the probability for large values of the population is well behaved. So that you don't have, you have a probability that you can normalize for large values of n. So you don't have things where the probability where you get always to larger and larger values of n. Right? Basically, you want that for large times, the probability of having a population that is much larger than a very large value is
okay. Yeah. Exactly. Sorry. Yeah. Exactly. Okay. Thank you very much.
Sure. Any other question?
I have kind of a philosophical question, but I don't know, like, well, now that you asked for the questions about chapter 12, I like when we define the fitness, I don't know, it seems to me like it's like a posteriori concept because we assign a fitness trying to measure the probability of survival in some species, but as this probability comes out from random mutations, we can assign like a fitness to a species because we don't know how the environment is gonna behave in later times. So my issue is how can we assign like fitness to a species?
It is a very controversial in some sense concept. I mean, it's like we are going to talk for most of the next. I mean, we are going to always talk about fitness as a parameters of these models, but is in fact a very controversial quantity or parameter or concept. Right? And what you said is perfectly correct. So, in terms of, let's start with the easy part. In terms of models, that's not a problem. It's just a parameter, right? And I mean, these things we call F, and it's related to how much you reproduce compared to others. Or compared to some by baseline. Now, in real life, all the things you said are correct. So, what the fitness of an individual is not a property of the individual per se, or alone or in the vacuum, is a property of the interaction between the individual and the environment. Right? Now, that doesn't mean that that is less of a biological concept, right? Also, your behavior, which is encoded in something which is at least partially heritable, is a product of the interaction between you, is a phenotype, right? It's the product of the interaction between you and the environment. And the fact that you, I mean, there are many things that are phenotype, but they are not just, they depend on the environment, right? So it's very controversial of whether fitness is a phenotype. So it's really a property of the individual, or is a, I mean, yeah. So let me say a few things. So one is that fitness per se, as I said, is not a property of an individual alone. Right? You cannot say this individual has fitness trait, right? Is a statistical property of a group of individuals, right? But yeah, this is, I mean, there are many things like that, right? So like the number of eggs that a given bird lay is a statistical property, right? We say it's 3 for that species, but doesn't mean that all the birds of that species lay 3 eggs. So yes, fitness is a statistical concept, so it's not a concept of an individual, and in some sense is a posteriori, in the sense that it's something that that is context dependent, that emerge from who is present, what other individuals, what environment the system is exposed to, etc., etc. I mean, that doesn't mean that it's not something that is reproducible. Right? So I mentioned that the long-term evolution experiment, the one of Lenski, when since the 80s is like sort of every day is taking E. coli and put it with new medium and is watching evolution happening. In that case, you have evolution and you can sort of reproduce the outcome of the evolution, in the sense that if you take 2 strains taken at different times, you see that the one takes at the later time is going to win with the one takes at the previous time, right? So if you do a new experiment, you do many new experiments, you always see that the ones that has evolved for more time in that environment as an higher fitness is winning a competition race against another population. So the fact that has all this problem is, or that is context dependent, that is not a property of the individual, etc., 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 doesn't mean that is not something that is reproducible. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, but so like it seems to me that it's reproducible in situations of typical behavior, something like standard, but like if we have an environmental disaster or something like that, it changes completely like the parameters surrounding the individuals. So.
Yes, so I mean, but also, I mean, can be an environmental disaster, but can be a new species that arrive. Right? A new species arrive, then the fitness of another species or the fitness of different individuals within that species will change.
Yeah.
So
yes.
It's something, I mean, absolutely. It's something that is, and this is one of the big problems, right? That somehow we tend to think with these models and the models we're going to see about some fitness. I mean, we think about a fitness landscape. So somehow we're going to introduce this later, but we think that there are different types, different alleles, and these different alleles have a number associated to that is the fitness. Right? And this is somehow constant and context independent, while that is not the case. This is something that we know, and there are scenarios where we can sort of ignore it. So if we have, let's say, an experiment where the conditions are constant enough, we can ignore it. If we think that perhaps the conditions are varying, but somehow they're varying very fast or very slow, still we can effectively consider the fitness to be constant, the fitness landscape to be constant. Right? But yeah, but I mean, again, that doesn't mean that it's not a useful concept, and it does not mean that you can predict the fitness in some sense. So you can, if you understand something about the genotype and how that contributes to reproductive effects, you can say, well, if I have this genotype, I can infer what its fitness, right? But again, you can infer it in a given environment that you know. Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's controversial because in one sense it's something you can measure with experiment. In the other sense, it's something that is defined only for that experiment, right?
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yes. That's a very good point. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other question? Any other question? 3? Any other question?
Hello?
Oh,
Hello?
question solved for you. Yeah.
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question about the part in the poor design.
In there?
Hello?
Yes.
So in the part for the poor design, is it because at first, how do you say that it is poor? Is it in a way that it is not efficient? And is the reason for the poor design due to the lack of feedback mechanism?
I didn't understand, sorry. I didn't understand the subject. I didn't understand what you say, what is efficient and inefficient.
In the concept of poor design, why is it poor? I mean, why did you say that it is poor design?
I don't get. Can you write in the chat because I don't get
Okay.
the topic. I got, or if someone understood. Okay. Ah, okay, I got it. Poor design, okay, very nice question actually. So the question is, I mean, it's in the chat, but is when in the evolution part, I mean, in the introduction to evolution, I talked about poor design. What do I mean with poor? The point is, imagine that the concept I want to introduce is that evolution works in a very different way than the way like engineering works. Imagine that you have to build something to do a function, right? Then what you do is that you think about what is the optimal way to construct whatever you want to perform that function, right? So if the function you want to perform is to, let's say, go fast on a road, what you design is probably something like a car, and you wonder about aerodynamics. You understand that what is determining your inability to go fast is friction, and therefore you make it, I mean, you invest in aerodynamics. Then you understand that the size of the wheels is what limits your speed, and so you design the correct size of the wheels, etc., etc. Same way, if you don't want to go on a road you want to go, you want to navigate, what you design is a boat, and perhaps if you want to try to maximize speed, you design an hovercraft. If you want to maximize your ability to sail for a long time without the needs to go to a port, you design like a sailing boat that can go with wind and you don't need fuel, right? So all these kind of things, right? And you can think of this as an optimization process. You are trying to optimize some function and you go on and on refining this structure, right? Now, the key point here is that when you do that, you don't have strong constraints. Yes, you have the constraints of physics, but I mean, if you start designing something and that design sucks, what you can do is that you can take that project, you throw it away, and you start again. Right? Evolution instead does not operate that way. Right? I mean, if you are a smart engineer, I can give you a microwave and you can build an helicopter out of it, perhaps. Okay? If evolution can do that, sort of, but to do that, have to have something that is functional at all the steps in between, right? Which is something very difficult to do. So you want to transform a microwave into an helicopter, but you also want to have something that functions in between, right? This is sort of an analogy, right? It's a very metaphorical analogy. So the point is that design is determined by, is limited by the laws of physics and chemistry and so on. On the other hand, evolution is also limited by the fact that you have to, you can operate only with the structures you have available. Right? So you can, evolution can produce an eye over the over long times, but in doing that, it's not doing that like starting from scratch, right? It has to do that with the structures that it has access to, with the photosensitive cells that it has access to, and cannot do anything, right? So the way this works is that sometimes these result in structures that are very, very unoptimal. Right? So one example, which is very easy to understand, is giving birth in humans. Right? What happens for humans is that we are primates with a huge head, which gives us an advantage because we have a large brain and we can sort of do good things or bad. We can sort of survive in an environment and makes us very adaptable, our brain. But on the other hand, this brain sort of, the size of our head grew quite fast in the course of evolution, and there was no time to adapt the birth canal to having this head grow through the birth canal. So what happens is that, in a small fraction, but considerable fraction of women, the birth canal is too small compared to the size of the head of the kid. And then this is a huge problem, right? Now, this is a huge problem. Now we have modern medicine, so of course we can intervene. But if you are if you lived like, not even 10,000 years ago, but 300 years ago, in any, at the time, modern city, you were likely to die, or your kid was likely to die, or both were likely to die, right? So this is an example of a design. This is something that is very much related to reproduction. So you can think that it also have a huge fitness effect. So having a larger birth canal would be like very beneficial, but somehow evolution got stuck in that solution, and there is no, even if there is a strong selection pressure, it's not easy to find how to change things now that you are stuck with that. Right? Is that clear? Yeah. Or the other example is the human eye, right? we have the optical nerve which goes in front of the retina. This is, I mean, we can see very well, but this requires extra computation from our brain. And it's something that there is no engineer who will do that. The reason why we have that is because in the course of the evolution, we got stuck with that. Right? And now you cannot have any like simple mutations that conserve the functionality of the eye and put your optical nerve in the right place. So you got stuck with these suboptimal solutions. Yeah. So the concept poor design is because of that, right? Because you get stuck in suboptimal solution, and then you still need to have something functional. You cannot throw your project away, and you cannot start from scratch. Great. Any other question? Great. So, so if it works from you, I'll write a message on I'll check first with the calendars of other lectures for next week. But if it is okay for you, I will keep this time also next week. And I'll post a message in the following days on the chat. I'm also behind what I wanted to do in terms of correcting the homeworks. I hope to send you a feedback soon. And as a present for Christmas, I'll probably give you another assignment quite soon. I'll give you a lot of time to do it, of course, but I'll give you the second and last assignment, which will be on the part of evolution. So, okay.
Okay.
So thanks a lot. I mean, yeah, if you, yeah, great. Okay, so I'll see you next week. If any of you is sort of following sometime the lectures of the winter school, I mean, of course, do it only if you have time, or if you want to invest your time in that. I mean, there is no pressure on doing it. But if you do it and you have questions, something is unclear, please let me know. Or if you want, I mean, everything is going to be on YouTube. So again, there is no sort of particular pressure on watching them now. But if you want advice on what to watch or things that particular things, please let me know, and I'll sort of also give you advice. Okay? But again, no pressure. Great. So thank you very much. This is I mean, if you are in Trieste, this is the first day of Bora. So so it's winter today. And I mean, I think it's, if you experience this today, it was probably, yeah, an interesting experience. You can hate it from now on. Okay?
Thank you.
So I hope things are gonna go better soon. Anyhow.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye. Thank you.